Good evening. Welcome. Hi. Thank you so much for coming to Book Passage this evening. We're so delighted that you're here supporting your local independent bookstore. Before we begin, if you can check that your cell phones are off, I would greatly appreciate that. My name is Monica Golden, and I will be your host for this evening's event. We love it when authors are in conversation together, and tonight we have a very special treat. Bay Area author Jan Ellison is discussing her book, A Small Indiscretion, with Kirsten Jones-Neff, a poet and author of When the House is Quiet. A Small Indiscretion is a page-turning literary debut about a heroine coming of age, a troubled marriage, and a mother who must excavate the truth of her past. A Small Indiscretion was named a 2015 San Francisco Chronicle Book Club pick. Please welcome to the stage, Jan and Kirsten.
Hello?
I don't know. What do you think? How is that?
Can you hear us?
Oh, yeah.
Can you hear us fine? Okay. Maybe we don't.
Yeah.
Are they on? Are they off? They're on.
So I personally think this whole in conversation thing is kind of cool.
Yeah.
And I was saying earlier, maybe have to think about like, where does that end? Like, you know, how far into conversation do you get to go publicly?
Ask me anything.
I think with this group, it looks like maybe we can talk about all kinds of things.
Sure.
But, so I just want to start by saying that I don't think I've read a book that I can think of that captures so beautifully that moment in time when you're a mother and everything floods. Your life is constrained, and yet it's also just emotionally opening up in so many ways, and things are coming back, and there are layers of emotion. That's what it brought back for me. A time where there are physical limitations, and yet a lot is happening emotionally. It's very powerful that way and resonates that way. So I wanted to just say how much I appreciate that.
Thank you.
I think as both of us are women who have tried to write with young children. I have 3 and Jan has 4, and that presents a very particular challenge. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
But so that's sort of just how I wanted to open, but I thought it would be wonderful if maybe you could read for us first. I know most people here have mentioned to me that they've been reading the book or have read it or are somewhere through reading it, but I think it'd be wonderful if you wanted to
I will read. How many people have read the book, just to get an idea? Okay. I think I will read just a couple of paragraphs then from the preface, in which we hear Annie's voice when she's 19, and then I will read a couple pages from the first chapter, just so you get an idea of the book goes back and forth in time, and you'll get a sense of both. London, the year I turned 20. I wore a winter coat, the first I'd ever owned, a man's coat purchased at a second-hand store. I wore it every day with a silk scarf tied around my neck, imagining I looked arty or sophisticated. Each scarf cost £1, and I bought them from an Indian woman who kept a stall in the tube station at Victoria, where I caught my train to work. They were thin, crinkled things, not the sort of scarves that ought to be worn to work in an office, or that offered any protection against the cold. But I could not resist them, their weightlessness and soft, faint colors. The money I spent on them and the habit I adopted of wearing a different one each day seems to me now a haphazard indulgence, an attempt to prove that I was the kind of girl capable of throwing herself headlong into an affair with her boss, a married man twice her age, and escaping without consequence. And then I'm just going to skip ahead to the end of the preface. And she's arrived in London, gotten a job, found a place in a boarding house, and she's talking about living there. My rent was £60 a week, including breakfast and dinner. The meals were served buffet style in the dining room downstairs. There were eggs and toast and stewed tomatoes for breakfast, meat pie or fish and chips or baked ham for dinner. It was a source of solidarity among the other boarders to complain about the food, but I could not, in good conscience, join in. I loved those meals, the bounty and efficiency of them, the thick gravies, the custards and puddings and soft, fat rolls. It seemed a small miracle to me to have so much available and to be paying for it all with my own wages. It pleased me, too, each time I handed over a pound coin in exchange for a scarf, and when I purchased at the second-hand shop in Notting Hill the winter coat, a full-length, single-breasted gray tweed with covered buttons and a wide collar that could be turned up against the cold. I wore my coat and scarf and descended the escalator into the bowels of Victoria Station, emerging again into the dense, unyielding energy of city life, feeling brisk and stylish and superior to the person I'd been when I'd left home. I was taken over by a sense of liberation and possibility. Any false steps I made now would be mine alone. Any foolish moves would be private business that had no bearing on the hopes and dreams of others, and it would not later be a source of remorse or reckoning or pain. What a shock to discover, some 20 years later, that exactly the opposite was true. To learn in the aftermath that I hadn't known the half of it. To stand in my San Francisco kitchen last June and slip my finger through the flap of a white envelope and to find a black and white photograph of myself in that tweed coat, standing on the chalk down of the white cliffs of Dover, waiting to board a ferry to Paris. It was a photograph innocent enough to anyone unacquainted with its history, its treacherous biological imperatives, its call for reparations left unpaid. It had been solarized, just as the photo of Louise and the baby had been. It had been subjected to a light source in the darkroom, causing a reversal of dark and light. My form and Malcolm's, along with the inch of air between us, were bathed in silver light that brightened at the edges like a halo. Louise and Patrick on the other side of the photo were deep in shadow. The scarf I was wearing had been hand-colored a blunt red. It was tied around my neck like a choker, like a noose. But it wasn't me who was about to hang. And then I'll just read...
Okay, book.
I'll read a bit from chapter 1. And this is the morning that they find out that their son has been in a terrible car accident. He's 20, the age that she was in the chapter I just read. It's not always wise to assume that just because the surface of the world appears undisturbed, life is where you left it. Monday morning, September 5th, 2011, 20 minutes after 8. I was doing the breakfast dishes when the phone rang. I wiped one hand on a dishcloth and picked up on the second ring. I spoke a quiet hello. I should say that she's addressing her son, who cannot hear her, but she's still addressing me. You were sleeping directly upstairs in your sister's room, and after the commotion of the night before, I didn't want the noise to wake you. There was static on the line. I was about to launch into my national do not call list speech when a stranger spoke your name. I said what I believed, that you were still asleep. You couldn't come to the phone. The stranger corrected me with a contusion of words. Automobile accident, broken rib cage, possible brain injury, blunt renal trauma. I began to shake. I called for your father. I thrust the phone at him as if it were burning my hand. Part of me was certain I would find you where I'd left you, on top of your sister's bed, her decorative pillow shaped like a ballet shoe still cradling your head. I flung open the door to her room. I stepped toward the bed, but you weren't in it. Your truck was in the driveway, but you were nowhere in the house. We learned later that you'd been riding in the passenger seat of an old Volvo sedan when it flipped just north of Santa Cruz. The driver's seatbelt had held, yours had not. Jonathan and I battled our way through the San Francisco traffic and sped 30 miles south on the highway, out of the fog and into the sunlight. We reached the peninsula and took the off-ramp and argued over the route in voices clipped with panic. We made our way through that alien topography, the university with its low, wide sandstone buildings and flat expanses of sky and lawn, the shopping center with its vats of flowers and its acres of parking lot, the hospital inside its immaculate suburbia. that sunlit peninsula pressed between the green bay and a bank of hills the color of straw that 5 months later your father would begin to call home. We drove up the hospital's main drive and circled the extravagant brick fountain, an oasis of shaped trees growing in its center. I was the one who'd counted your drinks the night before. I was the one who'd somehow incited a riot, then in the aftermath, set about making sure my 3 children were safe for the night under the same roof. I was the one who'd moved a sleeping Polly in with Clara so you could have Polly's bed. If I had not made you stay, if I had not altered that sliver of fate, if I had not plucked that single wing from that single butterfly, you wouldn't have ended up in that car. You'd have said your goodbyes and driven across the Bay Bridge and fallen into bed and slept until noon. At the entrance to the hospital were 2 dogs, eyes half closed, chins flat on the ground in a posture of patient defeat. That was the attitude to avoid. The task at hand, my task, was not to wait patiently but to act, to undo the twist of fate, to be vigilant and merciless in advocating for your medical care, to accept nothing less than a full recovery, to ask every question and overturn every stone. Did I suspect that first morning that there were some stones better left buried in the dust, that I might wish for the results of certain biological interrogations to be kept hidden, not only from you and from your father, but from myself? I don't think I did. Denial, as any addict in recovery will tell you, is not defined as knowing something and pretending you don't. It is failing to see it at all. I'll stop there.
So, as you can hear, I think that you have, there's so many layers of things going on in different eras in this book, and I don't think any stones are left unturned in each of these eras. And from a reader's perspective, I'm curious, which of these eras, which of these moments, which of these scenarios was the genesis for you for this novel?
What I really started out, well, I'll back up a little and say that when I was a sophomore in college, I decided I'd been studying French for 4 years in high school and then 2 years in college, and I was quite convinced that I was completely fluent and that I should go to the Stanford in Paris program because that was for very serious French speakers, totally immersive, program, and live with a French family and speak nothing but French and study at the Sorbonne and whatnot. So I applied for the Stanford in Paris program and I wrote my application in French, showed up for the interview, and it was like in this room, some room in the French building, and it was a huge conference table, and there were like 12 people sitting around this conference table, and they started to interview me in French, and I forgot how to speak French. Needless to say, I was not accepted into the Stanford in Paris program. But I really wanted to go to France. There was another program in Tours, but that was supposed to be for people who didn't speak a lot of French.
Yeah, like me. I went to that. Yeah.
Anyway, I thought, I'll just go to Paris anyway. And another friend from Stanford said, yeah, let's go to Paris. And I had a few AP credits, so like we all did, and so I could take a quarter off, still graduate in time. So I took the money I'd saved that summer doing this ridiculous summer job that I had. I'll tell you about, since so many of you are from Stanford. I was selling temporary help for this temporary help company, Apple Temps or something. And I rode around campus on my bike with this bag of apples, going around to Stanford departments, leaving an apple for them and our little brochure and saying, when you need temporary help, call us. It's boiling hot in summer. One of the worst jobs I ever had. It was supposed to be commission. Like I didn't, I got my $6 an hour, and barely any commission. But I did manage. I was living in the trailers, which are no longer there. But I did manage to save enough money to go off to Paris with this friend. And we arrived in Paris, and we need to find a place to live, which would turn out to be much more difficult than we expected. So we sort of canvassed this. We had no idea how to find a place to live in Paris, but we happened to see something posted on some bulletin board, 2 college boys who had an apartment to rent, but what they were doing was that their parents were paying for their apartments, and they were moving in together and then renting one of the apartments out to make extra money, but of course not telling their parents. So we rented this apartment from them for 3 months, but we were never allowed to answer the phone while we were living there, lest the parents call and find out that the apartment had been rented to someone else. Anyway, we lived in Paris, we traveled around on weekends, and then it was time to come home. I was supposed to be home for Christmas, and I just didn't. I just decided I cannot come home. I'm not ready to come home. I'm meant to be here in Europe. So I went off to London, figured English speaking, I can get a job. And I showed up in London like 10 o'clock at night with a backpack. I literally think I had $50. I check into a youth hostel, and I managed to convince this temp agency, again, the temping, to let me sit in their back room and practice my typing, because there was no way they could call me and tell me they had found me a job, because I was living in a youth hostel, and this was before cell phones. So I could sign up with them, but they couldn't really get me a job. So I just sat in the back room for a couple days, practicing my typing, writing some terrible poems and bits of stuff, the crap that I was writing then. But I was writing. And then they sent me out on a one-day assignment that turned into a 6-month job. But what I remember, and this is a long way of answering a short question, what I remember is that I turned 20 a couple weeks after I arrived, and I put coins in one of those iconic red phone booths long enough to have my mother wish me a happy birthday, and hung up the phone, and I walked outside, and I thought, there's nobody in my life can reach me right now. I am totally alone, and I am totally free, and I can do whatever I want. And it's only 30 years ago, but it's a moment that has been lost. Our children will never experience that, and thank God. But it's also a loss for them and a loss for us, because we can't give them the same liberty, the same freedom to own the world. And I really feel like walking through the world all alone is a very, very different experience, and I'm not sure my kids have ever fully experienced it. So then 10 years ago, so fast forward 2 decades, and I was doing some writing then, and I did a little writing after college, but not a ton. And then I left my job and started to take classes, and I had amassed a few short stories, and I thought, I'll write a coming-of-age short story set in London, of course, because that is where I came of age. And it got to be about 25 pages, then it got to be about 80 pages, then it got to be about 350 pages, and I realized I was not writing a short story, I was writing a novel. So that's how the novel began.
That makes it sound very easy that you wrote these 350 pages. Somehow I suspect there's more to that.
Well, the 350 pages was sort of just material, and it was all this set in Europe, and it was all this, I thought there was tons of stuff going on, there were people having affairs and going off to Paris and strange foursomes, and what I didn't realize that it didn't really have a plot, because, you can have a lot going on, and a book could still not have a plot. And what I've come to think of as plot for a novel is, what is the urgent reason for this story to be told right now? And you've read some novels, right, that don't necessarily have an answer to that question, and that's a certain kind of a novel, but it was not that kind of novel that I really wanted to write, but I didn't know how to write the other kind. And the way I found out it didn't have a plot is that I did this workshop. It was actually a short story workshop, but I workshopped 30 pages of the novel, and that means you submit your manuscript to a big group of people, they all read it, and then you all critique it. And this was in Portland, and I was, Charles D'Ambrosia was the workshop leader, he's an amazing short story writer. And he said, well, this is great, I want to send it to my agent. He sent 30 pages along with several short stories to his agent, and this is back in 2007. And she read it all, and she called me, and she said, I love your short stories, I love your writing, blah, blah, blah. She said, let's talk about the novel. And I was like, uh-oh, that doesn't sound good. She said, one, I would hate for you to write a quiet novel, which freaked me out because I didn't know what a quiet novel was, and I didn't know if I was writing one, and I didn't know if I should or should not be writing one. And then she said this about plot. She said, a novel cannot just be characters walking through time making decisions. A novel has to have something bearing down on the characters that is completely outside their own control. And I thought, is there anything like that happening in my novel? No, mostly it's that these characters are interacting with each other, but there's nothing really bearing down on them. So I stopped writing completely for about 2 months because I was upset and discouraged and in despair as one gets. And then I got back to it and I kept writing. And then this is where it gets to be a sad story. I used to write in Starbucks when my kids were little, and I was writing in Starbucks one day, and I found, without really noticing, that the narrative had shifted from being first-person point of view, from a young woman's point of view, to being second person, a direct address to a son who had been in a car accident, from a woman who was 20 years older and established, happily married, and a mother of 3. And I knew where that story came from because it came from my own life, and it was a story that I had been resisting for a long time because it was very sad, and I wasn't sure it was my story to tell. But my first cousin, I have 3 cousins. They're just I have 3 first cousins, and this one had been born 16 weeks premature, and this is now like 30 years ago. So when he was born, he fit in the palm of his father's hand, and they said he's not going to live, and then they said he's not going to see, and then they said he's not going to speak, and he did all those things. And he went to Sonoma State, and when he had finished his junior year, he went home to visit his parents, and he left in the morning on Father's Day, and he made them agree that they would not get up and make him breakfast and send him off because he was 21 years old and he could do it himself. And so they agreed. And he's an only child. And he got in his car and started driving to Sonoma State from Southern California, and somehow was in this terrible accident, crossed the center divide on Highway 5 and went headlong into a pickup truck and was airlifted to a hospital in the Central Valley. And I was in the Bay Area. The rest of my family was in Southern California. My aunt and uncle flew there, and I drove, so I got there right after they got there and was just with them through that whole time. And after a week, they had to make the decision to turn the machines off because there was no hope. And we were all there when that happened. And in the moment when he went from life to death, I knew I would never be the same person again. None of us in that room would ever be the same person we had been the moment before he died. And yet, as a writer, I knew I would never be the same again. But I hadn't kind of accepted that if I wasn't writing about life and death, then I wasn't writing to the bone of something that I personally understood because I had witnessed it. And so that day I was writing in Starbucks, I think I didn't decide, I just let it in. And I thought, well, I can always, when you're writing a novel, you never think anybody's going to read it anyway. So I thought, well, I'll just see how it goes. I'll keep writing. But I think that's the day that, the character, the son, Robbie, in the book has nothing to do, he's not my cousin or anything like my cousin. And Jonathan and Annie are not my aunt and uncle, but it was just having witnessed something like that informed that, what became then the reason for this story to be told, and then the part in London and Paris and the current story sort of started to intersect and inform each other in a way that evolved as I finished writing the book.
It strikes me, the story strikes me as very realistic in the way that you can be going along with your life that feels kind of normal and regular, and then things pile up very quickly and in a somewhat chaotic way and random way and come together rapidly. And so all of a sudden the rug is literally pulled out from under you in many ways, and then you rebuild. So, but I think you manage that to convey that and also carry us along with that sense without losing us. So, the other scenes that are very vibrant and alive, and for me, are some of your childhood scenes, or not yours, but the scenes that you've written. Tell us, how much are those scenes? So there are scenes that take place east of LA in
Tahunga.
In Tahunga?
Well, it's Tahunga where I grew up. And it's not Tahunga.
Yeah, describe it. Describe that.
So that's probably the part of the book that is most kind of lifted from my life, except the alcoholic father. My father's not an alcoholic. He was at my reading in Seattle last night, and I always think he's such a good sport because he shows up to all these readings, and everyone thinks he's an alcoholic. He orders his one IPA, and he will only drink IPA, and he will only drink one. But aside from that part, the character of the father is sort of related to my father, and I did grow up in this crappy town in LA, and actually one of my classmates was, one of my elementary school classmates was there in Seattle at the reading last night. It was very fun, and he said many of the people we went to elementary school are still there, still living that exact same life. It's just kind of this trashy town.
One thing you say is the sewer hadn't reached it yet. Well, that resonated because the sewer hasn't reached us yet, where I am up in Nevada. So.
Yeah, in the books they have to pump their cesspool because they can't afford to get it. They siphon their bathtub because they can't afford to get the cesspool pumped because it's $100 a month, and that's right out of my life. And it's always overflowing. And it was like in the patio, right outside our back door. And so, you walk out like, uh-oh. So we did not let our bathtub water out. We siphoned it. We had a hose running through our living room for most of my childhood. And usually we had the door propped up. It's, LA, it's not cold, except sometimes in the winter. Usually we had the door propped open, and the hose would just be going out the front door. And then, and this is in the book, one day my dad said, we should make this permanent, and took a sledgehammer, put a hole in the wall, and the hose went through it, and it ran into the yard, and it ran into a particular spot, and there's this clump of geraniums that did very well on the bathwater. And it's just, the chaos that we lived in. And then, my dad took the kitchen cabinets off when we first moved in because he was going to refinish them, and he set them next to the garage, and there they were for 5 years. So we had no kitchen cabinets, and my mother was just like, well, it made it easy to get to things. So it was that kind of town. But I went to private schools because that was the deal my mother had negotiated, that if we're going to live in this crappy house in this crappy town, they're not going to the crappy public schools. And so
How did you end up in the town?
I was 10, and we had been in various apartment buildings my whole life in LA, and it was the only place we could afford to buy a house. My mom tells the funny story. She says we were driving around house hunting. We had the dog in the car because the dog was pregnant, and she was afraid if we left the dog at home, we would have the puppies at home. And actually, I had the first puppy when I was in the back seat with it when I was 10. And she tells a funny story about my dad going in to look at the house. She went with him. We stayed in the car. They went to look at the house. She came out after 2 minutes. We're not buying that thing. And then he came back and said, let's buy that thing. So we bought that thing.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was $24,000. How much that house cost. Yeah.
It's interesting. You kind of ruined my theory a little bit in that I thought your father was an alcoholic. And
everyone does.
And yes, and those scenes all resonated. We had a very similar childhood, and my father was an alcoholic. And somewhere along the way, you describe the children having an allegiance to their father. And boy, did we have an allegiance to my father. He was amazing, and he got us all addicted to adventure.
Mhm.
And that's what I see Annie as, having. So I kind of assumed it was alcohol, but I think it's a personality that is for children is very worthy of allegiance, and it makes it hard for the wife or husband.
It's an intoxicating personality, and it is hard for anyone to stand up to it, even when my father was an alcoholic, but he was this sort of he was addicted to dreaming big schemes and coming up with, the next big thing we were going to do. And so there was always some big thing, and we were always part of it. And it was certainly hard for my mother to compete because she was working
Paying
2
the
jobs,
bills.
supporting the
Paying the
bills.
bills,
Right.
yes.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. But you wouldn't trade, I mean, I know I personally would never trade my childhood. Even, I think my mom probably would have, but wow, I feel like everything that I aim for in life, in a way, came from this somewhat chaotic but really beautiful childhood. Amy knew, my dad, Dominique, a lot of people knew.
Totally.
You remember him well.
And you were so grown up and adventurous when you were in high school.
Well.
And I was like, wow.
It is. I mean, of course, you can't regret the childhood if it makes you who you are and gives you all this
No.
material. But there are some things I
Might have changed
might
a little
change.
bit, yeah.
Not things about my parents, but the ways that I responded to that situation. Things that I certainly do not want my children to be doing, at that age, which they are now. Yeah.
I'm going to read something you wrote on your website, just because I thought you said it beautifully, and I think it also encapsulates the built-in tension in between, I won't say anything more, but freedom is intoxicating, marriage and parenting can feel suffocating. The burdens of family life are also precious, though. They are blessings we both celebrate and resist. We make our peace, then fight it. We make mistakes and we make amends. And if we're lucky, we carry on to treasure the laden, harried, unremarkable days, the blessed, barely observed constructions that are our adult lives. I think that's very rich and beautifully said and sort of encapsulates that tension. Annie, the main character, the all grown up Annie, feels like someone who at this particular moment, it happens to be a crisis moment, it happens to be a moment where there's a catalyst for a lot of introspection and some action, but it seems like she's experiencing that pull that can manifest itself as an identity crisis also, between freedom and commitment, and trying to figure out who she is really as a person, as a parent, and I wonder, I guess I'll just ask straight up, were you experiencing that as you wrote this novel? Was it a time in your life that you were struggling with the duality of your life?
I think I'm always struggling
Yeah.
with the duality.
Yeah.
And making my peace with it and counting my blessings and feeling, and especially when the kids are young. I mean, now that my kids are 18, 16, 14, and 11, and they're pretty much, raising themselves, especially since the book came out.
No choice.
Yeah, and when you have teenagers, the stakes are much higher, and so when there's something when you need to parent them, boy, you drop everything and you parent them. And when they're younger, you could never drop it, and so I think for me, in the early years, writing was the thing that I escaped into, and even though it seemed kind of crazy in the early years because I had had a career and I quit when my second child was born, and I'd gone half-time from home after my son was born, and then I immediately started taking writing classes, and I feel like I'm not sure I would have survived. I mean, I would have survived, but would I have been happy if I hadn't had that outlet? I'm not sure, because I found it to be very difficult. That combination of kind of boredom and joy. The joy gets you through, but the boredom is so intense when you've come from constant stimulus in a career, and I was in a fast-paced startup. managing 10 people, blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden, I'm like, wow, the minutes are going really, really slowly here. What is going on here?
Yeah.
That all changes, of course, as they get older. But in those early years, you don't really know that. You think this is it. And I did have this sort of unreasonable despair when I would have to think about what to put on the table for dinner. And having already made the breakfast, made the snack, made the lunch, made the snack, cleaned up all that, and now it's time for dinner. You're like,
What? Yeah.
but you can't really complain about it because all your children are healthy and you have food to put on the table. And what's your problem? She's doing it. She's doing it. She's doing it. They all seem happy enough. And I didn't have a really good support network. I just had dinner, but none of them are here, so I can say this. And I wrote a short story about this actually. I had dinner with the moms from the playgroup I was in when my kids were small. And they are just as dull as they were then. I could not believe that I had spent that many years meeting these women once a week, and they were my support. No wonder I was going crazy. Whereas, if we'd been in a playgroup, we probably would have been.
Had more in common.
Yeah. So that was part of the despair. Actually, this is an aside, but the movie rights we're optioning the movie rights to a producer, and
wow, congratulations!
That's
exciting.
And I met with her in LA last week, and she's great. I was very hesitant actually because a lot of Nina knows this, and other writers in the room know this. A lot of writers option their rights, and nothing ever happens, and it's year after year, and option after option, and nothing ever happens. Hollywood just holds it captive. But I met with this producer, and she's read the book 3 times. I feel like at this point she knows it better than I do, and she's she grew up in Hollywood. Her dad is huge in Hollywood. She just left his production company. Well, she left New Regency to go out on her own, and so I met with her, and I was like, oh, if anyone can make this happen, she can. And she knows the book inside and out, and she really believes in it, and she believes that it should be a movie, about a woman made by women.
And who does she believe should be Patrick?
Patrick. Who's in perfect cast.
We didn't talk about that. She was throwing out a lot of actresses' names, but I just, I'm not getting ahead of myself.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we could probably think up some good Patrick ideas.
Anyway, to get to what I was originally trying to say, she drove me back to my hotel, and I started telling her about the material that I wrote. In between writing this, in the middle of writing this, for a year and a half, I wrote 600 pages of another something. I'm not sure if it's a novel or 2 novels or something. I was telling her about it, and she said, we should do that as TV right now. She said, you can write the novel later. And having spent 8 years writing this one, and 10 years from the time I put the first words on the paper till when it was actually published, like TV, that it's a lot easier. You don't have to worry about all those words. So anyway, I'm going to use a few scenes from the short story that describes the agony of being in this playgroup and going to, brunches and baby showers and all of that, and just feeling like this is not the world I belong in. How did I end up in this world? And I think it was really just kind of a mismatch of the particular moms that I ended up hanging out with, because, there are all kinds of great women doing this same thing who would have a similar sensibility, but you don't necessarily find them. And I was the first person I knew to have a baby. Hillary remembers this because I was so sick. And she's like, what? I couldn't even walk. We took a walk one time when I was pregnant with my first child. I was really sick with morning sickness. And halfway, I was like, I can't walk anymore. We're going to have to call a cab or something. And a cop gave us a ride back to my house.
What's wrong with her? She's pregnant.
She's pregnant. She can't walk. So anyway, that's the story of the playgroup.
Yeah. Well, and I think so often when you feel stuck in something, it takes on a certain light. But for me, I have always found that when I'm writing, all of my life seems richer.
Yes.
Even the most boring, tedious parts seem more beautiful and just more
or
organic to.
Or you can see the humor in them, or you can see the story in them. Or you can, I agree.
Exactly.
It definitely, it's like living your life twice, living it the way you're living it, and then a different layer of emotions on top of it.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I want to make sure, I think we're supposed to go till about 8, so I want to make sure
Wait,
that...
I want to make sure you have time to read a poem. I asked Kirsten if she would read us a poem so that we get to hear her voice tonight as
That's
well.
very nice. Well, okay, but I brought them. I don't really have, I don't know, sometimes I have a clear idea about what to read, and I don't, but I'll just read something. Most of my poetry has to do with, you know what, I know which one I'll read. My daughter's in the audience here, so she's older now. I'm going to read an older poem though, when she was not older. So, and I think it relates somewhat to some themes in your book. So, I can find it. It's funny. These are all. I did a radio show a couple of weeks ago on Mother's Day. So the guy said, go through all your poems that have to do with being a mother. I pretty much marked every single one. So, okay. This is called Traces of a Woman. I stand in my daughter's dark room and watch the outline of her breath, the slightest up, the slightest down, arms and hair across the sheets. Her mouth rests open and I can see traces of a woman in the lips and dignity of her chin. She is my height now, and it's mostly in the legs. Long and thin, angled out from under a blanket, the white arc of her slender foot, toes falling into a dancer's point. This milk cream body is still hers now, only hers. And the dreams that run in twitches along her cheek are hers as well. I am scared of the stones that will be thrown into the still pool of her, of who will touch her, cling to her, harm her, or possess her. I want to lay my own calloused body over hers, a shell to her egg, and wait that way, breathing, slight up, slight down, until she is fully grown and strong. Well, does anyone have any questions for Jan tonight?
I have a quick observation just while you're collecting yourself. When you were describing your play group and how you're feeling, like in my head, I saw you put the phone receiver on the phone in London and be free. I was thinking to myself, it's like this 180. You're like, so like kind of just confined, and then you're free. So anyway, I just had that moment of the phone booth. And I thought that's who you are. You need to have that possibility of the phone booth.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that was just an observation for you.
Let's go to London.
In terms of feeling confined, I wonder as a writer what writing technique or craft element are you grappling with now that you're still digging into? I mean, after years of education, right? But as a writer, there's always something. I wonder what is intriguing you to dig deeper.
I feel like with my second novel, I'm facing all the same dilemmas as I was with the first novel. And really the question is, how do you keep writing when you don't know why you're writing the book? So I have scenes, I have characters, I have story, I have lots of stuff happening, but I don't know, well, I didn't know. Now I think I do know, but I didn't know during the year and a half that I was writing this where it was headed. And that is that's disconcerting to not know why you're writing something and to not know where it's going. And so my impulse is always to rewrite, thinking that rewriting is what's going to tell me, and second guessing that, oh no, maybe this is not quite right. Let me that's not quite what happened. And so I have a poster taped to the wall behind my computer that says "Get to the end of the story," and I think that is so critical for a novelist. If you second guess yourself and you rewrite before you know whether the scene even advances the story or what purpose it fills or why it's there in the first place, you waste a lot of time. I had an experience with the first book where I wrote this 50 pages and said, oh no, that's not what happens. Took it out. It's to do with the Malcolm character in London. He died, then he didn't die, then he died. But the first one he died, then I said, oh no, he doesn't die. Then he didn't die. And I had forgotten all about the first draft where he died. I rewrote it, and then I realized it was 2 years before I'd written it almost exactly the same way. So I'm trying to learn to trust myself and just keep going and get to the end of the story. And then that will probably continue to be my struggle because I love to revise. So there's always that temptation to work at the level of language when in a novel you kind of have to, if I were a poet, maybe that would be a good thing. But as a novelist, sometimes you have to carry on. Sometimes you have to work at the level of language because language is what is informing you and moving you, and it's where the emotion is coming from. But sometimes you just have to press forward and say, what happens next?
I read halfway through the book, so I probably don't know a lot of it that's going on. So
We won't give it away.
No, that's all right. I was actually hoping you'd tell me, like, I don't know. But the thing is the writing process. So I'm just in my mind visioning you when you started this 10 years ago. This is your first novel?
Yeah.
So 10 years ago, you have a 12-year-old, 10-year-old.
10 years ago, I had an 8-year-old,
8-year-old,
6-year-old,
and a 3-year-old.
4-year-old, and a 1-year-old.
And so you decided, I need something for myself, right? So you went to Starbucks. I mean, it wasn't really a decision.
We're home. Take care of yourself.
It wasn't really a decision. It was more of a compulsion. I had been circling in the Stanford Continuing Studies catalog. I'd been circling the creative writing classes for years. While I had this career, I didn't write a word for 7 years. But the minute, literally, like the day that job ended, I signed up for a class. And it was on Tuesday nights, and Dave, my husband, was supposed to be home at 6:15. He always got there at like 6:25. I was late for every class. And I'd had to like have the kids fed, and but my first teacher became kind of a lifelong, she's been my mentor for 15 years, so that was very lucky. But I remember one time leaving Saturday morning, and like I have to go write, and then we had like 4 kids under the age of 10. And my husband is standing in the doorway, and I've pumped a bottle of breast milk, which he's got in his hand. He's got the baby. The other 3 kids are like around, and I'm just so flustered, like feeling guilty, like what am I doing? But I have to go. I backed into my neighbor's car.
Like a couple cars out on the way.
Knock on the door, they're not home, write them a note. Okay, I gotta go. So, it was just a compulsion.
And then the worst is you get there and you can't write. And then you're so guilty because you're not writing anything.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Yeah, so going through the process. So you write a little bit, and you write a little story, but the story you initially didn't get to the end, right? You rewrote a little bit, then you wrote a little more. Then 2 years later, you rewrote part of it.
Yeah.
So it comes to a point where you submit it to someone, and then they say, oh, I like that, tweak this, tweak that.
Well, in my case, I wrote, then I took a year and a half off and wrote this other thing, and then I kind of accidentally came back to it. But I had never gotten to the end of the story, never had a first draft. This is like 3 years ago, almost now. And my mother sent me to I'd signed up for a novel workshop. She said, go. She said, your novel has been on my to-do list way too many years. Like, I'm taking over my mother's awesome. I'm taking over your household. You're going to the mountains. We had a place in Kirkwood. And I went and kind of rediscovered this novel, set aside the second novel, and kind of almost, I just said, like, I started reading it. I was like, I should just finish this novel. So much work. It's hundreds of pages. I should just finish it. But I didn't know how it ended, and I didn't know how I was going to resolve the plot. And I was reading Julian Barnes' The Sense of an Ending, and there's a letter in that book that kind of helps resolve the plot. And I just laid in bed that night in this this place in Kirkwood, and I thought, how can I resolve this novel? And then I almost got to the end by June of that year. So that was in March. By June, I had a first draft. In September, I sent it out to a bunch of agents, and I sent it out to 8 agents. 5 of them wanted to represent it. I signed with my agent. I did a huge rewrite through the fall, scariest rewrite, like a Humpty Dumpty novel in pieces on the floor, put it back together. Again, my mom came. I went to the mountains. I had like 1 week, sat in the chair.
Can she come?
No, no, she can't. Yeah, when she comes, she cooks, she cleans. She won't let the kids even do the dishes. She does the play dates, drives. I mean, she's a good stand-in. My husband loves it when she comes. And so then revised it again through the fall based on my agent's kind of revision critique. And then I finished, but I should preface this by saying that it took me 5 years to get my first short story published, and it was rejected 30 times. So now I'm going to tell you the story of a novel. I sent it to my agent on a Monday at the end of January. This is almost 2.5 years ago. He sent it out to 15 editors on Tuesday, and Random House bought it in a preempt on Wednesday. So
Easy.
So
Wow.
easy.
You know.
But I cut my teeth on short stories.
How was your relationship with the editor?
It was great. I had some difficult times editing with literary journal editors, but she said, you know, there's not that, she said, did you practice writing this book? There's not that much to do. Usually you have to do a lot more work with the debut novels, I think, just because it had taken me so long. And there was never a time, it was not uncomfortable at all. We worked together on that for about 4 months, and I had 2 editors. One did a kind of line edit, and then the senior editor did kind of the big picture, and she was great. That said, the publicity, the launching the book thing has been a little more surprising.
How does that go?
Yeah, you're very proactive too, which is great.
Well, you sort of
Kinda need to
realize, oh, I have to promote this book myself. And Random House did a great job, and we got a lot of great reviews, but then after about a month, they pretty much say to you, you're now on your own. Feel free to plan your own events. And so, but of course they don't tell you in advance that that's what's going to happen. So, and I now know that this is a pretty much universal experience, especially for a debut novelist, and the book is doing really well. So they're sort of reinvesting in it again, and for the paperback and all that. But I mean, they move on to the next book because their product is a series of books, and your product is a book. And so, for the writer, it seems like, oh, my marketing department just quit. But for them, of course, it's a different story. But still, for your book, your marketing department did just quit. You are now your marketing department, and so
And it tells you, I mean, because you have a very, very successful book, and so I think, like you said, most authors are having to dive in and get on Facebook and Twitter, or I don't know what all you do, but
the whole
Mhm.
thing.
yeah.
One thing I did, my dad and I had, you had asked the question about how much of the childhood part was related to my life. My dad and I had been kind of on the outs, because after I wrote this book, in the book, the father, to give it away too much, but it was this sort of contentious thing with the father and a kind of an estrangement. My dad and I had been, not really estranged, but I had not been that happy with him in the last few years. And then, he's a marketing person and a graphic designer, and and so the book's coming out, and I'm like, oh my God. I asked Random House if they were great, but they sort of got to their limit. I asked them if they would send me a Facebook banner with that on sale now, so I could swap it out on the day the book came out, and they said, oh no, we used up all the resources making those bookmarks for you, so we don't have the resources to do that. And I'm like, oh shit, I don't know how to do any of this. So I called my dad, and we've been working together like every day. We're in touch every day.
That's nice.
So we sort of,
That's great.
that's been the benefit of self-marketing.
Have time for one more question, if there's one more?
Anybody else? Oh, I guess well, I mean, if no one else does, I have one more. How are you with rejection and criticism now? I mean, has that changed? Because I guess I asked just because I speak to so many writers, and I guess I'd put myself in this book. It doesn't really ever change. There's a rawness for me, and but I don't know. I'd be interested to find out.
Well, I haven't had anyone look at any of my work for a while. There's, of course, the critique of the reviews you get, which at first is devastating. And then after I started getting reviews on Goodreads in the fall. And, there are tons of great reviews, but the ones you focus on are the ones that are like the 2-star or the 1-star. And there was a 1-star review on Amazon. I think it got taken down, but it was like, my niece ordered this book by mistake. I want to return it. 1 star. Do you understand? You just dropped me down, 1 notch. But that you sort of come to terms with because you have to. And I feel like now I'm wearing a coat of armor and there's nothing that can get through. In terms of someone critiquing my new material, well, I haven't had that happen for a while, and I'm very nervous about it because now I used to be writing in a vacuum, not knowing whether anyone was ever going to read it, and now I have an agent and an editor, like real people with real tastes, and I don't know how they're going to respond to my next book. So I haven't shown them it yet. Yeah.
You want to give us a teaser?
Yeah, it's it's the story of 3 sisters, and they live in Woodside, kind of in the midst of this Silicon Valley craziness. And they're sort of an old Woodside family who have fallen on hard times, but they're in the middle of kind of a Woodside that has not fallen on hard times. So that's sort of the backdrop. And the eldest and the most lovely has found out that she has breast cancer. The scene that I am writing toward is actually from an actual story that was in the news about a year and a half ago. I don't know if any of you remember this, but there was a shooting in the Roku parking lot in Saratoga. Roku, the set-top boxes. And it was an engineer there who was having a rough day and popping some prescription pills, and he went out into the parking lot to wait for his ride. He called his father. His father was going to pick him up. Some of his colleagues thought he was suicidal. They dialed 911. The sheriff arrived. There was an altercation in the parking lot, and the sheriff shot and killed this man.
Right.
And I happened to meet his best friend about a week after that, and he told me, my best friend just died. Maybe you read it in the news, and here's what was happening in his life. And so all of a sudden I knew that these 3 sisters and their husbands and the male characters, the book is very different in that it's told from many people's point of view, some men, some women, and I just knew that the male characters who have a beef with each other are going to end up in that parking lot, and I'm not sure what will happen, but that's the scene I'm writing toward. But it's now in Woodside, Saratoga.
Thanks for that preview.
Yeah.
It's very exciting. Well, Jan,
I just want to say a quick thank you to Kirsten for doing this, and
Oh, well, my pleasure.
it's lovely to be in conversation with you and not have to carry the whole show that you're doing. And Monica for hosting, and to this amazing independent bookstore. I know many of you already have my book, but while you're here, if you want to pick up someone else's book,
Yeah.
that's how bookstores support themselves, by people buying books. So.
thank
And
you for
thank you
coming
all
out
for
tonight.
coming.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jan.
Thank you for inviting us.
Glad we buy books.